We're just setting up Decouple Media's mobile studio here outside of the very scenic Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, which provides around 20% of Ontario's electricity, all carbon-free. This plant has been ticking since the mid-70s, providing over 50 years of clean carbon-free power. It was built instead of a coal plant, a 4 gigawatt coal plant. That would be one of the largest coal plants in the world. Would have been spewing out carbon, heavy metal pollution, sulfur dioxides, etc. But instead we've had, again, 40, 50 years of clean, air pollution-free, carbon-free energy coming out of this plant. So that's why we're here to save this bad boy. Good boy.
What are you guys saving?
Plant.
Saving the nuclear plant?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't seem too scared of it.
Not really.
If you had told me 2 years ago I was going to be swimming like within eyesight of a nuclear reactor that is on the water and then I would be running in with a smile on my face, I mean, no, I just certainly would not have believed it. But thank God I've got a doctor here with me who has convinced me that it's not going to do any harm to me. And in fact, according to a study in Kerala, India, maybe it might even extend my lifespan a little bit. So,
not enough radiation, bro. Not enough radiation for that.
So here we go. Not a single three-eyed fish, not even one.
I gotta say the most dangerous thing on that beach, there's some like really sharp pebbles and I ran in like super enthusiastically. I'm okay, I didn't cut myself, but feet are a little sore, but other than that, a very special episode in a very special location. We are broadcasting, I mean, I guess not live, it feels live to me right now. I'm feeling very alive. And we're right in front of the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, literally, I don't know, I'm guessing with my rangefinder on here, 300 meters away from one of Ontario's clean air and climate cathedrals. Anyway, I'm handing the reins over back to Jesse Freeston, who many of my listeners will know, especially if you went all the way back, 85 episodes back to episode 1. Jesse really helped get this whole podcast off the ground. We had a Reflections episode, I think 25 episodes in. It's been too long, Jesse. Welcome back, and I'm kind of handing the reins over, and you're the boss, you're the host.
I mean, it's worked out really well in the past. At least for me, I've always had a good time coming on here and taking control. You know, it's like, which you don't always hand over easily, right?
Right,
I mean, like,
right.
for example, the discussion we've been having for the last 3 minutes was whether or not I'm allowed to call this uncouple.
Right.
Right? So I'd like to think of like, that's what I do. I come in here every once in a while and I uncouple what's been going on so that we can all understand it. You know?
Fair enough, fair enough.
And, or to what are the lessons, like what are the lessons we can pull out and bring in somebody who maybe not an engineer or a scientist necessarily, just sort of talk about the communications aspect here and how are we communicating and all this stuff. So starting with that, demystify this for me. My hair's still wet, I'm still wet. I just jumped in water that I think maybe about 4 days ago, I was listening to a podcast involving with somebody from the Clean Air Alliance here in Ontario, who was describing the threat of this building in ways that would make what I just did sound absolutely insane and masochistic and potentially suicidal.
Like Jackass, like a Jackass stunt.
I do feel a little, I loved Jackass as a kid. My friends and I used to do some VHS stuff, Jackass style things, jumping off of things we shouldn't be jumping off of and stupid stuff like that. And it really, I did feel the energy of that, like, you know, reverberating in me, you know?
Yeah,
as we were doing it.
Was it Angela Bischoff by chance that you were listening to?
Yes.
Yes, so Angela Bischoff, God bless her, is a ardent anti-nuclear activist here in Ontario. She's one of the kind of 2 people running the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which is very ironically named because they're a group that I think really exists primarily as an anti-nuclear force. They were very involved in lobbying for a coal phase-out in Ontario. Very good thing. We achieved the greatest greenhouse gas reduction in North America by getting 25% of our grid cleaned up, getting coal off of it. But they wanted that to be done with natural gas. The Clean Air Alliance did. They were taking money, about 10% of their budget was coming from Enbridge and Union Gas. As recently as 2009, 2010, it's in their report. You know, fully at that time when they published the report, I guess natural gas wasn't such the bogeyman that it is now. In any case, that coal phase was accomplished with nuclear. Angela is still one of the premier anti-nuclear voices. Incidentally, also anti-vax figure. I'm not sure how she feels about the COVID vaccine. I don't want to misrepresent that per se, but certainly she was against the Gardasil vaccine, came out strongly against that at some point. So anyway, I don't want to get too unrolled there, but it's important because this plant, you know, I think has been vilified. And I mean, even myself, before I was a nuclear advocate, you know, just to situate ourselves, this plant is about 40 kilometers from downtown Toronto, Canada's largest metropolis. And I used to drive past this plant not infrequently. And I used to kind of drive a little faster when I saw the Pickering sign. I used to hold my breath, which is just hilarious because this puppy doesn't put out any air pollution at all. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's for me too, Jesse, this is a pretty drastic kind of shift.
Yeah, so take me through as a doctor here, like what did I just expose myself to? I fully submerged myself, my ear cavities were exposed, my nasal cavities were exposed, at a distance at which if somebody was to put a for sale sign up over there, I could read it clearly. With my glasses.
I mean, we swam in Lake Ontario. I mean, the Great Lakes, for those, most of the listeners are international here. I mean, it's a huge water system, fresh water system. You know, the size of each lake is like the size of a small country. I think I had a Taiwan guest on saying like my country would fit in one of your lakes. And yeah, I mean, this nuclear power plant uses cooling straight from the lake. We don't have cooling towers here, so which makes it even more sort of just melt into the background environment.
Melt easy now. Melt Communication Studies 101 about nuclear. The word melt we do not use around a nuclear plant. Okay.
Meld
into the action? Yeah.
I don't know if that's the word I was looking for. A little tired here, but yeah, I mean, one of the things that the anti-nuclear folks bring up a lot is tritium. Which is a isotope of hydrogen and has a very weak, what's called a beta decay. So there's, you know, alpha, beta, gamma decay, which is the source of most radiation outside of, you know, neutrons and cosmic rays and things like that. But there is a trivial release of tritium, which is honestly, you know, as a doctor who's looked into this, I would drink the Fukushima water that's being released into the Pacific Ocean without any concern. To put it into context, I mean, people freak out about it because it's, you know, an isotope of hydrogen. It creates titrated water, H2O. And so the anti-nukes will say, hey, this gets into, you know, every area in your body. It could incorporate itself into your DNA or be right next to your DNA. That's dangerous. We have potassium-40, an isotope of potassium that has a beta decay 80 times more powerful. We have 4,000 of those decays every second in our body. I mean, it just comes out of this perception that the world is this pristine, non-radioactive place, when in fact, you know, we live in a radioactive soup, and we've adapted to it over billions of years of evolution of life on Earth. So it's, you know, it's like they freak out about tritium. This plant was built instead of a 4 gigawatt coal plant. And I mean, and that would have been in the 70s and 80s, well before we had a lot of scrubbers on coal towers. I mean, it would have killed thousands of people if this were a coal plant and not a nuclear plant. So it's just, they don't have the perspective. Yeah. And they make a mountain out of a molehill, I guess is how I'd put it. And a molehill isn't dangerous. You can fall off a mountain, but you can't fall off a molehill.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, you know, I mostly take what you say as truth, you know, especially when we get into the medical stuff or whatever. But you do have a bit of zealotry going on with the nuclear stuff from time to time. So I did look into this before I jumped into the water a little bit. Right. And the highest levels of tritium that they've recorded, so I can't remember what the unit is. I'm assuming it's parts per million, but it's like 18.
Yes.
So yeah. And then the science says that like the lower threshold of potentially dangerous tritium is like 7,000.
Yeah.
So it's like, and that's the highest ever recorded level. So I'm taking it on it that I will not experience any ill effects from jumping in that water, other than the maybe small cut I have on the bottom of my foot from those pebbles that were a little rough honestly, on the way in.
I mean, I'm a very pale person. I burn very easily. I did not bring sunscreen. I didn't really like compute that we were going to be sitting on a beach recording an episode of Decouple next to a nuclear plant. And yeah,
it's not going to help that I'm also very pale, and so there's like a very good chance for those of you watching on YouTube, by the end of this, are going to worry that we have acute radiation syndrome.
We're going to be like lobster red. It's not acute radiation syndrome. It is just us getting a good old-fashioned sunburn, which is like orders of magnitude more dangerous than anything this plant has ever done to our health.
Right on.
So yeah.
All right. So, is there anything else we could say more about the kind of fears of radiation that I think we've mostly touched on that. Like, like what would happen if there was a Fukushima type incident here? There's like people living right there, like right next to us. Right. There's a boardwalk. There's people all over the place. What's the like terror dome zone here?
The terror dome. Yeah, I mean, this is wild. Like I feel very naive. I've been into nuclear now for 3 or 4 years. I've got a podcast with 85 episodes talking with nuclear experts. I've never been inside a nuclear plant, full disclosure. This is the closest I've ever been to a nuclear plant. I think for those of the audience that have not been inside one, I think this is a pretty unique plant in that there's not a fence, with, kilometers of land. I speak out of ignorance here, but I think it's astounding that we are so close. As Jesse was saying, there's a subdivision, 200 meters in the other direction of the plant from here. There's a nice little boardwalk and kind of touristy area with some cafes. CANDUs are super cool. You can see there's a dome there. That's one of the eight reactors. The 8 CANDU reactors are contained in those domes. And you'll see a slightly different structure in the background, and that's actually the vacuum building. And so in a Fukushima type incident, one of the things that happened was, as a consequence of the meltdown, a lot of hydrogen formed because of the meltdown, because of, I think, the zirconium rods starting to melt, which created a lot of pressure within their building, and because they didn't vent the gas, which they really should have done, it would have had a much lower radiologic effect. It blew out. So there's tons of different backup systems here and containment, but if in a worst case scenario, that building would suck any accumulating gases into it, they would condense, fall down to the bottom. So it's a really cool plant.
How's it going?
Hey, that's my fucking name.
Laurier?
Yeah, Laurier.
Or basketball? All right. As you can see, there's some people going by, or as you can hear, I guess there's people going by. There's 4 kids in the water swimming right now. The interesting thing here is there's definitely days where you're not supposed to swim here, but the reason is because of E. coli from the sewers getting backed up. If there's a lot of rainfall, it's human poop that can make this water dangerous.
Indeed. No, that is true. That is true. Our primitive Canadian sewers, the storm sewers can mix with the sewage sewers if we have a heavy rainfall. So that's when we don't go swimming.
You're out here with some signs as well, some Save Pickering signs.
Yeah.
We're here with the Pickeringians.
The Pickerites.
The Pickerites.
The Pictons.
So, Picton, for the record, is the name of the worst serial killer in the history of Canada. We're not going to go into Picton. So yeah, the Pickeringians.
Sure.
Pickeranians, and we've talked to a few of them, and they don't seem to be too worried about this plant. I mean, it's like, it's really free. It does actually look like this could easily become a horror movie in about 2 seconds. Like, if you've seen any horror movies involving radiation, there's children in the water here, the plant's right there. The plant kind of looks like hell. We were talking earlier, you were saying like a few coats of paint on that thing, maybe some information about how safe it is, could go a long way.
A friend of mine, Myrto Tripathi, who works with Voices for Nuclear, which is a French nuclear advocacy group, they've created graphics and submitted them to EDF, the big national electricity company, of ideas of branding, like clean, reliable electricity, carbon-free electricity produced here, etc. And I mean, it would cost OPG maybe $10,000, I'm thinking, just to do
That's Ontario Power Generation.
Yeah, the owners of this plant, a small amount of money to paint the side of that dome with a nice message, maybe a nature scene. Just had a little guy, 4-wheeler drive by. They're taking the garbage out from this very, very scenic beach. But the other context of Pickering is, again, this plant, built instead of a coal plant, saved many lives, is something that guarantees our low carbon grid. And our big nuclear operator is shutting it down and replacing it with natural gas in 3 to 4 years. And that pisses me off a lot. So a lot of mixed emotions here on the beach in Pickering.
Yeah, and how's that going, the Safe Pickering campaign? What's the status?
I mean, it's interesting. I talk about like the Canadian nuclear establishment, and there's kind of like the managerial class, and then there's the working class or the union people. And the managerial class, the people running the big associations, they are really against Pickering. They have made the economic argument that they're going to make more money burning gas. They're not primarily committed to climate or clean air. So they're kind of our worst enemy in a sense. They've started an aptly named or ironically named Center for Nuclear Sustainability, which focuses on excellence in decommissioning nuclear power plants. It's kind of the wrong move in a climate crisis at a time when we need to 2x or 3x our grid capacity. Emmett Penny, one of my good friends, talks about these things as climate cathedrals or clean energy cathedrals. We can't sacrifice infrastructure like this. So it's very frustrating. So on the one side, there's the sort of managerial class, the major organizations and trade groups that are anti-Pickering, frankly. And then there's the unions, and there's 3,000 people working at this plant who are going to lose their jobs, and a total of 7,600 full-time equivalent jobs that will be lost as a result of this plant closing, based on Ontario Chamber of Commerce study. So it's wild. We had a big auto plant in a neighboring community in Oshawa, the oldest auto plant in Canada, 4,000 workers. When it closed, the province was trying to almost nationalize it, like a very conservative government was going to step in. Turn it into maybe a battery electric vehicle factory, all sorts of plans there. Not a peep about this place closing and the thousands of jobs, high quality union jobs, high tech jobs that will be lost. So.
And the gas plant will have how many workers that will replace it? Like,
yeah, I mean,
these gigawatts will be replaced by, job per gigawatt here is what, like 10 times less? Or?
It's, a job per megawatt hour. It's 3,100 megawatts, so there's a job per megawatt hour. I ran the calculations the other day. Each worker working here offsets 3,333 tons of CO2 per year working here, based upon this place being replaced by natural gas and the emissions intensity of natural gas. So yeah, I mean, climate heroes work here. And as Jesse was alluding to, modern natural gas plants, they're small parking lots because, 30 people can run a large natural gas plant. So we're going to be losing tons of high quality Canadian jobs, as part of our green recovery. It makes no sense.
Okay, so let's go through, kind of the thought experiment. I'm a Pickerite. Sure. And I'm walking along here and I talk to you and you've got your stethoscope out and you're talking about nuclear energy and how great it is and clean air and all that good stuff.
Right.
And I'm saying, okay, but what are you going to do with the waste? What is happening with the waste right now? Like, how much waste are we talking? How dangerous is it? Where is it?
Sure.
Where's it going to be 20 years from now? Where's it going to be 100,000 years from now?
Yeah. I mean, so waste from Pickering is stored on site right now, mostly in dry casks, which are concrete, steel casks. It's shielded. What's inside is very dangerous. If it was not shielded, you would get acute radiation syndrome and die very quickly.
From this distance, or
no? I mean. There's the inverse square law. Like every meter back, the dose falls by a factor of, I think, 3 or 4. I guess if it's inverse square, 4.
Interesting. We have a similar rule with sound in recording sound. You want to get the mic as close as possible the further you go.
Hopefully our sound quality is good, guys. But yeah, I mean, so basically, it's in these dry casks. It's the total volume of Canadian nuclear waste produced in the last 60 years. Would fit in one hockey rink stacked the height of one telephone pole, so I think 32 feet high. That's the waste we care about, right? That's the high level waste. There's low level waste like people's garments that they've taken off after doing some work, which can be put in a landfill. It's not a dangerous level of radiation whatsoever. We're working on getting what's called a deep geologic repository in place to move this fuel off-site and store it forever. Again, if nuclear waste was a big problem, we were generating so much of it, we couldn't store it on this site, which again is probably the size of a Costco. This clean energy cathedral, which powers...
That's like the mega supermarket.
Right.
For anybody who's not in North America.
Yeah. This produces enough power for 3 million people. The greater Toronto area is probably about 5-6 million now, but the old city, the basic city, we're producing that much power, and all the waste is on this footprint here. We're going to move it to a deep geologic repository, which will hopefully be approved and built as the sort of ultimate solution. It's controversial because, in 40, 50 years, we should have the reactor technology commercialized to be able to turn that waste, the 95% of it that has not been used, into beautiful carbon-free energy. in what's called like a breeder reactor.
So that'd be the thorium?
No, it's this fuel. It's uranium fuel.
So it'd still be the spent uranium.
But it's put in a fast spectrum reactor, which can unlock a lot of the unused energy. Anyway, what drives me nuts about this waste question is people are like, it's forever waste. I mean, it's not because it's decaying, but whatever. Let's say that it is. It poses a risk or a danger for an extended period of time, longer than written language per se, right? That sounds freaky, right?
Yeah.
And there's all these engineered barriers that are put in place, like the casks themselves. They would be capped in copper, which would be very erosion resistant, and then packed with bentonite clay, which is very avid at picking up atoms and small molecules and it binds them, right? But what was explained to me recently was the rock layer that they want to put it in, well below the water table, by the way. Would take a million years for water to percolate 1 meter through that rock, right? So it's like nuclear waste, again, for people that aren't aware, it's not like The Simpsons. It's like ceramic pellets, essentially. They're pretty insoluble, but let's say that like the mechanism for nuclear waste that's buried deep underground to get out and hurt people, presumably is that it needs to be dissolved in water, and then that water needs to geyser to the surface into our drinking water, into a field of corn or something like that. I don't know. But again, this water, even if it gets through all these man-made barriers over the course of thousands of years, it doesn't move through this rock. This rock is stable. It's 400 million years old. So
we're not going to drop it into an active volcano, basically, is what you're saying. Like there's no mechanism in the earth where it is that's going to shoot it back out.
Yeah, I mean, so it's preposterous, and it's playing off of our worst fears. So yeah, it's funny because sometimes, I get this allegation, I mean, I have an Australian friend who occasionally will call me a fanatic or a zealot. I really strive not to be that, by the way, but, when you look into what are, the problems levied by anti-nuclear folks, they're issues, but they're profoundly solvable. It's not inexpensive to build a deep geologic repository. Like, waste is something that needs to be carefully managed, but it's very, very manageable. People are capable of it, and I think that's something I like about the kind of eco-modern, nuclear advocate world is like we're optimistic about people. We're like, people are awesome. They can do stuff. Like, we can split atoms. We can move from the combustion era of human history to the fission era, which again is what can potentially save us from the worst of climate change.
This leads to something I've run into a few people, especially some people who know something about the CANDU reactor and a little bit about international relations, or perhaps a lot.
Sure.
And so this idea of like, do we trust humans? And to use this stuff safely, securely, and only for civilian power purposes, right? This is kind of the assumption. Hopefully, if you think about all 192 countries of the world having nuclear power plants, this would be the hope, right? Something like this. And so, this person that I was speaking to, who's very, very learned on these topics, was pointing out that the CANDU technology that we're so proud of here, that's behind us right now, how it's so safe in terms of a meltdown, but that it has this negative aspect, which is that it produces plutonium, and that they were saying, and now correct me if I'm wrong, that India and Pakistan, or just India, or that this reactor played a role in those countries getting the bomb. Is that true?
Right. I mean, so it's a complex history, and I won't pretend to, be a historian or a total expert on it. It certainly wasn't a CANDU power reactor that was used to create the fissile material for the India and Pakistani bombs. It was a research reactor that was given to the Indians by the Canadians that was misused to create that fissile material. On the weapons issue, it's a real issue, don't get me wrong. What's dangerous is not the civilian nuclear reactors or the potential of making energy. I mean, if you have the state's resources and you have people who are trained in nuclear physics and nuclear engineers, like anyone can make, any country, a rich country or a middle-income country can make a bomb, right? Like, that's the potential. You can't put that cat back in the bag. Like, as much, when I was 18, I would have, I was probably a little more geopolitically naive, and I'd say, like, yes, we can, just with a treaty, ban nuclear weapons, remove them.
Have this great festival with Putin and Biden, everybody's singing while they break it all down.
China, I think, is on a massive build-out of their nuclear arsenal right now. Like, the way we deal with nuclear proliferation is we fight imperialism, we strive for international brotherhood. We create a prosperous world in which there's less, resource scarcity, and we stop invading the Middle East for oil because we have, lots of fish in here at home. I'm kind of making a little bit of humor out of it, but
But it's a hopeful argument.
Yeah.
It's this movement does really appeal to hope and belief in humans. And
yeah. And I mean, it's what's I think one of the most compelling stories is in terms of a swords to plowshares is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had such a huge stockpile of highly enriched uranium to be used in nuclear weapons. 20,000 warheads worth of highly enriched uranium was down blended, made less enriched, or they blended in depleted uranium, turned it into reactor fuel, and for 20 years, 10% of U.S. electricity was Russian warheads being turned from swords into plowshares. So the way to actually get rid of nuclear weapons and this dangerous fissile material, highly enriched material or plutonium, is to use it in our power reactors. So it's a complex issue, but again, I think, and one I want to acknowledge, is something that we need to be careful with. But again, I think humans are awesome and it's manageable. And again, we need to move beyond combustion. Like beyond petroleum. I'd love to turn that in beyond combustion and see BP become a nuclear company. Here's to that.
I don't know. So you fundamentally trust humans. I mean, you work in an ER, like
right.
I mean? You see the results of not the best human behavior on a regular
basis.
basis.
No, but I mean, I work in a hospital, which is a highly complex environment. Tons of very multidisciplinary, tons of people working together. It's a high risk environment. There's lots of super sick people. You make a mistake, you enter an order wrong, or it's processed in a wrong way. There's real consequences, right? And people do die from medical errors in hospitals, right? But on the balance, I love hospitals. They do a lot of good. My family uses hospitals. My son's alive because of an incubator in a hospital and a highly trained team that was able to deliver, that kind of neonatal critical care. So I find that analogy helpful. I used to be, I've lived a lot of lives. I've worn a lot of hats. I used to be kind of an anti-civilization. Technology is the source of social fragmentation and hierarchies. Whatever. I was a naive 18-year-old, heading into an arts degree. But yeah, that flipped for me going into medicine and being part of a large, complex institution.
One of the things you told me about, though, like staying with this thing about, I really try to convince you here.
Right.
You were talking about, for example, I was trying to understand why shifts were so long for doctors.
Right.
And you said, well, it actually has turned out that the mistakes you might make when you're on hour 11 of a shift are actually less dangerous than the mistakes that can be made by having an extra handoff of patients per day. So the fact that you only have 2 handoffs, you have 2 12-hour shifts, and the fact that there's only 2 handoffs of patients per day as opposed to 3 saves more lives than the lives you lose by having tired doctors.
Yeah, it sounds so common sense. Health worker shifts should be limited to 8 hours. Because you're going to be more alert, and trust me, that's a good argument. But it was actually tested and researched in Europe, and there was more patient harm as a result of the handovers. It's a dangerous moment in medical care because you know your patient intimately, you admitted them, and you can only convey so much in a handover. So I mean, maybe there's a handover culture that can be improved. That I'm not saying is written in stone, but that is interesting.
I guess, so what I'm saying with that is at this stage of the history of nuclear power and nuclear energy, there are protocols and things that make it less sensitive to things like this, like a shift change, and somebody else comes in and thinks things are cooling when they're actually heating. I don't know. I don't know enough about how this stuff works, but those kinds of human errors just haven't led to meltdowns.
Well,
it just doesn't happen.
And this is why I think I'm I'm bearish on advanced nuclear and very bullish on existing technology. Is that it's a complex technology, and we've learned a lot operationally about how to run these plants. I mean, this plant early on, the cool thing about CANDUs is you can fuel them while they're online instead of having to turn them off for 2 months every year or two. CANDUs can be run constantly, and that was a big economic argument for them. But the early capacity factors, the percentage of the time they were producing full power was only 75%. And we've upped that into the 90, 94 range. One of the reactors at Darlington, which is the sister plant of Pickering, set a world record for a thermal power plant over 1,000 days of continuous operation. Just having a helicopter.
We're going to have to take a little cut here. We're
Yeah.
getting flown right over top.
So picking up where we were dropping off there, basically, you know, this existing infrastructure, we know how to run it really well. Our capacity factors were 75%, they're now high 90s. And, you know, after 3 Mile Island, for instance, the industry started really sharing operationally a lot of, you know, human resource management, how to run the plants really, really well, lessons learned. Because, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all in this sense. If you have an event like that, it casts a shadow over the whole fleet, nationally, internationally. And so there's unprecedented cooperation and a really strong knowledge base about how to run these things. That was one of the big problems in Chernobyl, was that, you know, there was this hubris, and because of the Soviet system, a real fear and not an openness in terms of sharing lessons or admitting a fault or something like that. So, you know, it's an interesting little side note.
Yeah, and I guess in here, like you know, I remember when I started as a journalist, I started at a place called the Real News Network, and the guy who started it, Paul Jay, was a documentary filmmaker. I've done the opposite that he did. He started as a documentary filmmaker, went to journalism. I started in journalism with him and went into documentary film. And he started as a documentary filmmaker, and then after the Iraq War, he said that people were making their decisions on what they believed was true in the world based on what they first saw. Like their belief about whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was because there was a few days of constant information to that effect.
Right.
And then the like later information, what better done investigation, all that stuff comes later and is in a headline.
Right.
So it comes later and it isn't a headline. And so in the case of nuclear, you talk about 3 Mile Island. So nobody dies at 3 Mile Island.
Zero.
And potentially 3 Mile Island, because of, you're saying there, like the industry had to do a whole bunch of like thinking about things, renewing things. It's potentially, it saved lives maybe because it made better safety protocols.
Yeah.
But the point is that 3 Mile Island's in the news all over the world. People still talking about it today. I think most people probably think people died there.
If you were to talk about people included in a list of nuclear disasters, right? And it's like a disaster in which no one died, and the highest dose of radiation received was something like a chest X-ray of radiation, right?
Right.
Harmless.
Yeah.
Harmless.
And I've been, you know, I've been listening to the podcast of the anti-nuclear people, and one of them is hosted by somebody whose big claim at the beginning of every podcast that I've listened to of hers is that she was living a kilometer away from Harrisburg, or a kilometer away from 3 Mile Island, when it happened, and that she's still carrying the trauma in 2020.
And that's what we know. The danger of nuclear energy, in terms of, you know, people dying from it, is because of fear. And it's again, I say these people to some degree, the anti-nuclear activists have blood on their hands because they create and sow the conditions of panic, right? And panicked evacuations are just that woman's like chronic anxiety and worry about this. Like, am I going to develop cancer because I was exposed, in her case, probably if she was indoors, etc. Like the highest doses received by the civilian public around there were about a chest X-ray.
Right.
Which is, again, completely insignificant. And would she hesitate for a second to go get a chest X-ray if she thought she had pneumonia?
Right.
Not at all.
No.
Right? So
and like things that have to do with danger are news.
Right.
Anything that has to do with safety or upgrading of safety or something has become more safe can't be a news item. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, a whole new round of operators at the plant like just got their containment pressure release badge or whatever because they just finished their 8-week program. Like, it's like that's not going to be on the front line of the Toronto Star. You know, it's like.
Well, I think more interesting again. This plant was supposed to be one of the biggest coal plants in the world. This is what this would have been. That was the plan in terms of the, you know, this was a time of rapid expansion of the grid. And they were like, yeah, we want to build a massive coal plant near, you know, our largest city. And that, you know, the lives saved by this plant is in the thousands, for sure. For sure.
And this is happening all the time, right? In the sense of like, there's no follow-up on things. Like, you know, they'll have like Taishan, was it Taishan that happened?
Yeah.
And so it was this fear thing, and then there's going to be news in Europe, and they're going to interview some Greenpeace representative, and they're going to talk about how this is a total disaster, and it's going to be horrible, and there's not going to be edible food in that area for 2 billion years or whatever. And then it disappears, and there's never a follow-up. Like, I don't know, what's happened in Taishan since, that was what, a few months ago?
Yeah, so it was like, you know, it's one of these new European pressurized water reactors. It's like generation 3 plus. It has 2 containment domes. You know, this is all secondhand from Mark Nelson. We have a great episode on Decouple about what is going on at Taishan. But essentially, there was a leak of the fuel bundles, right? So there was trace amounts of radiation that were leaking into, I believe, the primary circuit, et cetera. Small releases into the environment, again, totally insignificant in terms of like comparing that to natural background radiation doses, a fraction of what you just get from the natural background. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of turned into, you know, is this another Chernobyl in the making or something, right? They have actually, you know, they kept running it because it was a time of peak demand in China. Blackouts, brownouts are not good for people. And so they have turned it off when demand went down, and they're working on that issue. It's a new reactor type, again, which is part of why I am so in favor of building what we know how to do well. Plants like this have operated, you know, basically flawlessly with no deaths. For, you know, something like almost 40, 50 years. So, you know, I think we should keep doing what we're good at, particularly at a time when we're not good at building new things.
Little update, I think we're up to 9 picorites swimming in the water from what I can see. There's also a lot of birds that seem to be all right. And like, I mean, it is quite interesting. There's a documentary I saw on the area around Chernobyl, the exclusion zone, and all the animals that are living there now. And it's like this amazing National Geographic or Discovery Channel documentary, incredibly beautifully shot, these incredible animals, and there's these horses that were thought extinct that are now there, like wild horses, and you know, beautiful things, and the narration every 30 minutes. I'm sorry, in a 30-minute documentary, like I think it happens probably 4 or 5 times, like, you know, it's like, the little squirrel doesn't even know that they're living in the most dangerous place on earth. And it's like, you know, that squirrel is like probably, I don't know how the lifespan of squirrels, but it's probably 3rd generation squirrel living there, you know? And it's he seems to be fine, you know, he seems to be doing all right.
The greatest danger to wildlife in the world is human activity, right? And so, I mean, the Malthusian environmentalists should love Chernobyl because it reduced, you know, there's no humans really allowed to live in the zone. Obviously, there's a lot of tourism now and there's a lot of scientific study. But yeah, I mean, it's Europe's greatest nature preserve. It's full of wolves and moose, and I believe it's the Polanski horse. It's a Polish-sounding horse. It's a rare horse, wolves, etc.
There is a bird who changed color apparently because of the radiation. Did you see this?
Yeah, I think I heard about that. And I mean, there was the red forest. Pine trees are much more sensitive to radiation, I believe, because of the number of chromosomes, some kind of a genetic vulnerability. So that forest died. Like, I'm not trying to minimize it and say there's no impact and sound super cavalier. And obviously there was a huge impact in terms of people's lives disrupted, etc. But Geraldine Thomas's work was very interesting, that the dose from the main radioisotope, you know, other than the iodine, cesium, which has a half-life of, I believe, around 25 years, and therefore, you know, has a mechanism to be dangerous, releases, you know, high-energy radiation, was on the order of around 10 millisieverts of added dose over 20 years, which is the equivalent of getting a full-body CT scan.
So is that the argument? Like, for example, when people point out the lifespan or the half-life of these radioactive elements is to actually flip it and say, well, that actually means they're not, like, the longer their half-life, the less dangerous they are?
Exactly, yeah, because the you know, the atom is breaking down, releasing radiation. You know, in the case of natural uranium or depleted uranium, once every, God, I'm a little pressed on my numbers here, but I believe it's in the billions of years. I think it's 2 to 4 billion years, right? So every 4 billion years, that atom splits and releases its radiation. How long is that in your body for? How long is your life? You know, so it's insignificant source in terms of radiation damage. But something like iodine 131 with a half-life of, I believe, 8 days, you know, is breaking down frequently in your body, and it's all concentrating in your thyroid gland. And particularly if you're a child, your thyroid gland is rapidly developing, mitosing, growing. That's a high-risk time. And so that is the one cancer that we've got a documented uptick of in the aftermath of Chernobyl.
What about the people who say, I don't trust the Soviet records? They tried to cover it up by, you know, they wouldn't even admit to the world that it had happened for a few days. Like, why would I trust those records? Why?
I mean, I think it's more a case that the Soviet health system, you know, fell apart. And so there's probably some errors in record keeping, but you know, it's not an area of my expertise. You know, in terms of the studies that have looked at Chernobyl, again, there's the Chernobyl Forum, That's 8 UN agencies, hundreds of scientists, the participation of Russia, Chernobyl, Belarus, countries that would have every motivation to maybe exaggerate or look at worst case scenarios.
You meant Ukraine, I think, right?
Sorry, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And
the squirrels in the Chernobyl exclusion zone are also participating in those.
No, this represents high quality literature, high quality methodology, consensus between argumentative scientists, right? We've seen, COVID science kind of happening in real time, how messy and gross it is. I mean, these statements take years to develop and involve a lot of arguing and sorting out and reaching a consensus, right? So this is what I call kind of scientific consensus level evidence. And then you have reports that were sponsored by the EU Green Party. That's the other report on Chernobyl, 3 scientists, very limited in terms of their methodology and their review of the literature. You have the Yablokov-Nestorensky study, the founder of Greenpeace in Russia, and the methodology included attributing every excess death after 1986 to Chernobyl rather than the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rampant alcoholism that followed, the economic collapse, those health impacts. So,
any social scientist worth their thing would say when an event like that happens, you can't isolate factors anymore. It's just
totally. And but you watch the HBO Chernobyl series, beautiful filmmaking. But at the end, I think there's a statement that there's some controversy about the number of deaths as a result. But I think they reached sort of like 200,000 based upon, pooling these studies.
But what you're saying, to what you're saying, the main character in the film commits suicide at the end.
Yeah, to be honest, I got one episode in, and I think like some other nuclear advocates, I couldn't go on.
Okay, this is what I want to talk about. So a lot of people listening to this right now might be saying, okay, but this is all novice level stuff we're talking about. Like this, we're on to bigger and better things in Decouple and all this stuff. But like, really, what I get out here is like modeling that conversation with somebody who doesn't really know what's going on. You guys need to watch Chernobyl. You know what I mean? Like this is like what. This was a huge hit. Like this this show is everywhere, and it's like at some level you have to be able to engage at that level.
That's true.
I was teaching teenagers how to make videos, for a while, and at the beginning they are all into YouTubers, and I find YouTubers these like narcissistic, uncreative, annoying people for the most part, and I didn't want to go there. I'm like, no, we're watching Dr. Strangelove today. Like we're gonna watch great cinema, and then at some point I gave up and I got into it with them, and then they respected me after that.
For sure.
And I was able to acknowledge what was good and what was, and we started making them ourselves, and then they were willing to like, oh, what do you like? You took me seriously. You listened to what I like. So I think it's important for us to watch these things. I had somebody that I really trust in my life. I was telling them I started to work on this nuclear energy thing, and they were like, you need to watch Dark. Right? And I'm watching Dark. Basically, I'm like 5 episodes in right now. This one is very painful to watch because it seems to be that the argument is that nuclear energy causes time-traveling murderers. So like, it's like, there's still a lot of mystery in the series. But at 5 episodes in, there's these kind of like devastating shots of the nuclear plant at dusk or whatever, and then some kid disappears in the forest, and some guy traveled through time, and he's scary, It's like
I just think it's very interesting because we could be here, we could be anti-nuclear advocates or activists standing here. We could be carrying like a placard with a profoundly different message, and like it's interesting. Like you could set the scene, and you could be talking to these people and trying to scare the shit out of them. You can do a lot with this. I mean, this is not the prettiest building in the world, but. As we were saying, it could use a little spruce up. I wish I could be the art director here. But I totally agree with you. And I think what we're planning here is to do a stand-up event here. Speaking of like being an annoying YouTuber, I think it'd be fascinating to go around with you and a microphone and interview people. And hey, so what do you think about this? And we actually have had a couple conversations on the beach. One was with a retired auto worker, the Oshawa auto plant. It's a 100-year-old auto plant. 4,000 people were laid off. Big uproar about that. This plant employs 3,000 people, 7,600 full-time equivalent jobs. The government's not raising. No one's talking about all these people that are about to lose their jobs. Anyway, talking with this guy, he's like, "Hey, I saw your placard. What's that all about?" And we had a totally awesome conversation. He was like, "Yeah,
he's totally on board." Yeah,
I agree with you guys. And that's what I hear all the time from.
He's also swimming next to it.
That's true.
He's not like average man on the street.
I wonder if Angela Bischoff comes to this beach, if she would put her toes in the water or not.
Another episode.
Maybe we'll have like a counter demonstration out here. I don't know, but yeah, I'm very jazzed to be here. Like, which is strange. Like, again, the me of 5-10 years ago would be like, what are we doing here? Like,
so. The Oshawa plant, when I think of the Oshawa plant, because I was working as a journalist at the time, it was the financial crisis. In the US in particular, I was focused on, I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time.
Right.
And they stepped in to save the audio industry. And we were trying to make an argument kind of from the left, like our editorial department basically, making the argument with some union members that like you should, if you're going to buy this thing out, nationalize it, and put it to work doing something that's not a combustion engine that like could help us in the future.
Yeah.
Especially in some of these areas for the jobs. Like, I mean, you've got all these people who know how to work these machines or make a machine slightly like it, or could help you with engineering a new machine. They've got that savoir-faire, that know-how to do, and that know-how, and it's a total failure. Like, I mean, those plants are back making cars now, but for how long? I mean, they're not the most efficient cars in the world. They're not particularly competitive. China, I'm sure, is going to have some car soon that's going to blow them out of the water for half the price. And so where they could have been making a high-speed rail line, you know, like northeastern U.S. and southeastern or where central Canada, where we are, you've got like major centers that are right next to each other, like a nuclear-powered high-speed rail line that would connect like the TGV in France or whatever, that could connect Montreal, Toronto, Detroit, and then you look at the U.S. and it's actually perfect. There's 4 cities in a row.
Straight line.
Right? Yeah. So it's Boston, New York, Philly, and D.C., Washington D.C. are literally in a straight line. It's almost like they knew they were going to connect them, you know. And they run these shitty Amtrak trains on them. And so people don't tend to take the train, and it could be totally different with a little bit of imagination and a state with some creativity and some actual attempt and some hope to build something differently. We could tax this massive amounts of wealth that we have around here and build some of this stuff.
We could tax the gas, and that's another little thing that's going on here. We have a campaign called taxthegas.org, which is drawing attention to the fact that in Ontario we have this carbon tax, this market-based incentive policy to incentivize good behavior. Whether it's switching over to a battery electric vehicle because the price of gas is going up, or whatever the other smart choices are. But in our power sector, the gas plants that are going to replace Pickering are only paying tax on 10% of their emissions at the stack, which is just crazy. So I mean, if that was taxed, for every ton rather than just the 10%. That could be a big revenue base. It could disincentivize, the burning of natural gas, and we'd have money to refurbish this clean energy cathedral. So, but I mean, just like you're saying about Oshawa, same thing, right? There's 3,000 highly skilled workers who know how to run a nuclear plant. There's all the transmission, infrastructure here. I'm no transmission grid expert, but I know one who is, and he says it's really vital, and we're probably going to have to build a new natural gas plant to the east of the city just to be able to balance out the load in the city. It's just crazy. I mean, there's a lot of concrete poured here. That's a lot of the kind of embodied emissions in a nuclear plant. It's talking about life cycle emissions of various energy technologies. The longer you run a nuclear plant, the lower that life cycle emissions are. And people have done the calculations on CANDU, and it's something like 3 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. For reference, offshore wind is 10 grams. Utility solar is 44 grams. Natural gas, 400 or 500, coal, 8 to 1,000, right? So, this is like,
800 to 1,000.
800 to 1,000 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, So this is 3. This is a fucking miracle. We want to get to net zero, not do like creative carbon offsets. Like I bought my ticket for my flight to COP26, and there was an option to spend an extra $72 to offset my flight. It's fucking bullshit, right? Like we need to move past combustion.
Is that and is that the messaging? Like, I've been trying to use that messaging a lot. Like I try to identify who I'm talking to. I feel like the people that are most likely to get on board are kind of science geeky people that don't have an inherent fear of like technological complex things in some ways, or and they're not the only ones. I'm just saying, like, so when I approach those people, I'm kind of like, this this is the unlocking of Einstein's gift to us.
Right.
Like this is E equals MC squared. This is us this is that equation finding its.
Right.
Like, it's amazing to think about that we would discover that this climate change is happening and that Einstein would have left us this gift to how to unlock the energy in the matter so we don't have to burn things anymore. And I try to talk about it in that way. So I'm wondering, like, what are the different ways you found to talk about it? Is there different people? Do you have different pitches for different people when you're trying to make the pro-nuclear argument to somebody who's like either totally new to it or perhaps a little against it?
No, totally. I mean, I think I've been quite successful, like in our messaging. You know, and we're actually holding our stand-up event this year at the Climate Strike March, and I'm really looking forward. I went to one several years ago when they were in person in, I think, 2019, and everyone I talked to was very convincible. People aren't like rabidly anti-nuclear beyond that tiny minority. And they're open to it. They have some questions. You know, the question came up like, well, this, you know, deep geologic repository, what if like the future civilization can't understand the warning writing on it? And well, and what, right? Like,
that's from the movie Into the Future.
Yeah.
Great film. When it came out in 2010 or 2011, I absolutely loved it. And I was like, oh, it's terrifying. It's a haunting film.
Right.
But yeah, this is one of the moments in the film where you go, oh my God, the Emperor has no clothes.
Right.
These people that are going to shove a bunch of toxic waste into the ground and don't know what they're going to paint on the door. Like, you know.
And like in 10,000 years, frankly, if we don't transition to nuclear rapidly and radically reduce our carbon emissions, I don't think we're going to have a complex civilization. Like, I know it's not cool as an eco-modernist to be like a catastrophist, but again, the way I look at climate change is we're like a boat, you know, and we're trying to sail across the ocean.
Yeah.
And every way that we destabilize the climate and disrupt our ecological support systems, you know, like creating more drought and emptying our aquifers instead of like just being able to pull water to the ground, you know, having good soil versus, you know, it all running off, having rich oceans rather than it being in an acidic environment and losing a whole food web. All of those represent throwing anchors off the back of the ship, rebuilding after extreme weather events, destroy our infrastructure. All that slows the ship of human progress and, you know, and civilization down. And I can't see us flourishing and prospering, you know, in a 3, 4, 5 degree world. And so I don't think that those complex civilizations will exist that would want to drill 500 meters into, you know, some useless rock. We choose these sites because they're not, you know, there's not a gold mine. We don't bury our nuclear waste in a gold mine, right?
Right.
And so it's just, I mean, it's like these preposterous anxieties, right? It's as creative, bizarre sort of thinking patterns as the kind of Rube Goldberg that I described with, you know, this distributed energy system.
Now, to be clear, like, if they're bizarre, if they're irrational, that's not necessarily an attack on the intellect of the person.
No,
because they might have had their attention on totally other things their entire life, and they've been bombarded.
But it's a fantastically creative intellectual exercise to like think about how this waste becomes dangerous. Like if you actually think about it and don't think just about like a geyser volcano spewing it in, like I don't know what, like what is the mechanism, right? But so yeah, figuring out ways that it would be dangerous or figuring out ways to make, you know, a 100% renewables energy system work. It's creative thinking, right? It's like this is gonna back up that and that. You're gonna plug in your F-150 and that's gonna balance the grid while your smart stove or your water heater like, you know, powers down at this time to stabilize the grid, and we have flex alerts, and like it's very creative thinking. Like a Rube Goldberg machine it's awesome. Like that's why there's YouTube channels with like millions of viewers and followers that are like, wow, he found that way to like put the salt on his food, right?
Yeah. The OK Go videos. I've never seen this band OK Go. They're amazing.
Like respect, but it's not a way to kind of build a both climate mitigation and adaptation system. Like we need the simplest solutions. And if we can plug nuclear plants into existing fossil sites, take advantage of that transmission. Like people are like, well, that's the old grid, man. The old grid's not cool. And it's like, sure, it's going to be great to build like an Internet of Things smart grid that can act like I think it's great that we can sort of match, you know, demand and supply and smooth out, you know, peak demand. Like that's an objectively great thing, and we should move towards it. But like, should we pour all our resources into that to manage a like inherently unstable generating system, or should we, you know, like we're in a climate emergency and we're trying to build out infrastructure and prioritize our spending and resource allocation, like. That's like building this bizarre Rube Goldberg thing. It should not be our priority. Like,
and then the other thing that has been revealed to me, and it's hit me very deeply because I have done a lot of work around mining, Canadian mining companies. Like, some of my early journalism was in El Salvador. where there was villages fighting against a Canadian gold mining company, and they successfully kept the company out with a lot of creative activism and a few threats.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? Like when it came down to it, it was like, you know, it's not going to go well for you if you actually bring your expensive equipment in here. You know.
Right.
And so, and they to this day they don't have that dangerous mining in a very densely populated area. But anyways, all that to say is this argument about you talked about how this plant here has a life cycle emissions of 3 grams per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
The mining thing too, like this civilization-wide Rube Goldberg machine is going to involve digging up an incredible percentage of planet Earth, right? Like, This is an argument that I'm finding. Like you've told me sometimes that you've kind of given up on greens, or like you're not trying to convince that group anymore. And with that group, as we're talking about here, like what message do you lead with? There's so many talking points, there's so many things. What message do you lead with? And I try to think about who I'm talking to. And this mining thing for me has become really something I've gone at with the environmental, especially the old school environmentalists, the Rachel Carson type people. You know, it's like you really want like just massive piles of dead in solar infrastructure leaching cadmium. Like this is your vision, you know. And anyway, so I don't know what you think about the mining argument. How do you do it? How do you do the mining?
I mean, you know, it was funny. We were out postering last night, putting up pro-nuclear posters. There's, you know, as like nuclear advocates with no budget, and you know, with like a lot of difficulty getting into the media. I think the media like has a hard time interpreting us, and they probably think that we're, you know, just the industry trying to find a way to like manipulate the media.
Yeah.
So we don't. It's hard to get into the media.
Yeah.
We don't.
When you're out there with a sloppy bucket of wheat paste.
Yeah. I mean,
putting up posters, nobody thinks you're big industry. That's for sure.
Well, and also like we don't have the money. Like the anti-nukes like have big billboards in Toronto, right?
Yeah.
No GTA reactor. Blah blah blah. So this is how we do. But it is interesting. Like when you're putting up and wheat pasting, like painstakingly putting up posters, you read the other posters that are on the telephone poles in a way you never would if you were just walking by. And there was one that was like a anti-extractivism sort of poster, like imagining like, and it had some like indigenous looking person like cartoon like meditating and you know, some kind of eco village around it. And it's just like everything that we use that is not a plant, essentially, we are plant-based, or we grew it, or we hunted, or whatever, like everything's not a wicker basket, essentially, you know, was extracted, was mined. We need to mine in order to not die, like to have shelter over our heads.
At least at the numbers that we have now.
Well, even like, with any numbers, I mean, right? Like,
well, there was an age where, you know, I don't know if we were. Like,
it's still extraction.
Where
like
we apes, like you know, our close cousins, the bonobos, don't have mines.
Okay, we don't have houses. Yeah, sure. Okay, point conceded. But you know,
and there are tribes still out there that,
you know. But I mean, all that to say, these, you know, it's, you know, there's a mining impact from every modern energy source, shall we say?
Yeah.
But when I did that interview with the former CEO of Cameco. And you know, did the calculations on global primary energy, like all of the energy, you know, that we use for everything that we do. About 4% of that, close to 5% of that, is derived from nuclear.
Yeah.
And Canada's uranium mines, because of our 20%, you know, ore grade, which is insane. Most around the world is less than 1%. Anyway, because of the richness of those deposits and that kind of unobtainium. Powers about 20% of the world's nuclear fleet. So that's almost 1% of all the energy that all humans use for everything we do comes from, you know, again, these, you know, in these postage stamp sized mines, obviously like seen from the air or whatever, right? And, you know, it's complex. The world's not black and white. That is on, you know, Dene territory, right?
Yeah.
They're not getting, you know, huge royalties. They're getting like well-paying jobs out of it. You know, it's company towns still. Like, I understand if you're an anti-nuclear indigenous activist in those towns, it's not a fun place to be. I'm not trying to say the world is simple and black and white, but if we're going to compare relative mining impacts, like Canadians should be super proud of our contribution to, you know, making 1% of global primary energy essentially carbon free. That's kick ass.
Yeah. And delivered not by a massive pipeline to tear up all the indigenous communities on the way from the mine to where it's used. You can like put it in a pickup truck.
We brought a placard. Oh, someone's holding the placard right now over there. It says, and they're putting. I don't think they're putting it in the ground or something.
It's a kid, yeah.
It's a kid. It says no, you know, no pipelines, no link pipelines, go nuclear.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, you can't say don't like mining, go nuclear. There is mining involved. There's extraction, but it's a fraction.
Yeah, I think up until very recently, I would have found the concept of degrowth like very much identified with just sort of my general emotional feel about where the world needed to go, or at least the north, the global north. It felt like we were on a suicidal march, like right off the edge of the flat Earth, you know, and through this just ever increasing consumption of the natural world and
we need 8 planets, right? Like
yeah. And exactly, and the fact that the billionaires are already looking for new planets, and like this whole thing to me just looked like, oh no, and so it's like, yeah, obviously degrowth, you know, like this clearly something that we have to do. This is a project we have to do, and then, you know, as I've been listening to your work, obviously, and talking with you a lot, and reading some of these the work of Vaclav Smil and people like this, and actually looking at what that looks like and the benefits that we've reaped from these technologies and from some of the things we've done. And so I started with my more kind of degrowth minded friends, like, you know, we started talking about like, okay, what are the technologies and like the necessary mining and the necessary energy consumption that leads to a comfortable, safe, dignified life at some level, and then maybe we can ditch the luxury goods and unnecessary stuff, right? And so what you put on that list is like, you know, heating when it's too cold, cooling when it's too hot, hospitals, some sort of agriculture needs, some sort of basic transportation needs and ability to move around, and stuff like that, and communications. And once you add all that stuff up, and if you apply it equally, like you're saying, you don't have Africans in huts for the rest of time, and you apply this equally across the globe, it's a pretty high level of energy use. Once you get into like what we would consider a dignified life, or like a non-poverty situation.
You know, and I think it's because of sort of where I come from in terms of my ideological formation, but like I'm not like unsympathetic to like elements of the degrowth argument. Certainly I think we could degrow the billionaire class. And I mean, I'm a frugal McDougall just in terms of how I live, right? Like I don't drive a fancy car. I'm not really into big like consumer goods. And I think, you know, the upper middle class of the developed world could afford to, you know, rein themselves in a little bit. Like, you know, and that might be a controversial viewpoint in the kind of eco-modern community. Like it's funny, the tribal affiliations, and I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be liked. I'll be thrust out into the wilderness for making that statement. It's ridiculous. I am who I am, right? Like, and, you know, and obviously the developing world needs to level up. So in some ways, I'm making that degrowth argument right now, that we need to rein ourselves in the developed world and raise up the standards in the developing world. Obviously, I think that's to a very different threshold than what the degrowthers are thinking, right? You know, it's funny, you mentioned Václav Smil, like he's actually a bit of a degrowth thinker. He's like, you know, we lived pretty good lives in the 1960s, say. You know, if the developing world dropped back to that and we didn't, you know, fly away on vacations for a weekend to Cancun, Mexico, like we could afford not to do that. We could probably still be pretty happy. Like, I'm kind of sympathetic to that. I was talking to, it was actually to Michael Schellenberger, and his son had you know, God, why am I blanking on this for a second? A laparoscopic surgery for an intestinal issue, right? And that's a technology that they didn't have in the 60s. They would have done a great big incision. And he was like, you know, Václav says we should go back to the 50s. I'm really glad my son got laparoscopic surgery. Like, growth does allow for ongoing innovation.
But those flights to Cancun didn't, and aren't related to the advancement of medical technology.
Not per se, right? So, but what I guess what I'm trying to say, and this was a point that Mark Mills made as well, is that in terms of estimating energy use needs going forward, for issues like food, that's quite easy. Like the difference between starvation and gluttony is maybe 2,000-3,000 calories per day. For material goods, you know, embodied energy in material goods, like yes, we're using more and more, we have more and more consumer goods, but still that's, you know, by a factor of 2-3x is reasonable. We can make predictions on that. But in terms of information processing, I mean, our ability to sequence the genome of the coronavirus to develop the amazing vaccine technology that was, you know, the vaccines were developed in like 3 weeks. We had to do all the clinical testing to make sure that they were safe. But I mean, that's a miracle of modern computing and of artificial intelligence and neural networks and things like that, which consume enormous amounts of energy. So, you know, it's funny. I am sympathetic to a degree to elements of a degrowth argument, but I think where I set the bar and the standards is much higher. And we can substitute energy for mass, for resources, in a way that's really interesting. You know, recycling, for instance, requires enormous amounts of energy. If that energy is cheap and abundant, we can do more of it. That's good, right? You know, vertical farming, for instance, can spare land, right? And it requires a lot of energy, right? So because
recycling's one where I get off, because it's like recycling for me. Well, I mean, obviously certain types of recycling. You work in a hospital where it's like where it's a hygiene safety issue to have single-use things.
No, but like melting down
when I
steel,
think of like the degrowth thing that I'm fully on board with, it's like a culture of like you bring the thing that's gonna hold your drink with you from home, and then you take it back home and wash it, like just a minimal level of material responsibility.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And then it could be cool. It's like, that's my favorite cup. Or like,
I mean, here's a degrowth thing I'm sensitive, and I don't know whether to call it degrowth, right? But just like we could have standards on vehicles where, like, you know, we don't need to drive 3-ton, you know, SUVs. We can drive a 1-ton car. Like that's a pretty basic thing, which is like a government regulation. That can do a lot, and that's something Václav talks about. Is like the internal combustion engine is, you know, X times more efficient now, but we've made no gains in terms of fuel consumption because we're driving fucking boats around. That's stupid. So there's some nuance here, right?
You
know, overall, I'm not sympathetic to the degrowth argument. I think because of what you're saying, like where it sets the threshold is at an absolute poverty line, and it's like.
And we haven't thought of the die-off, like.
You haven't got the die-off, and then you can't have the you know, the cake of modernity and eat it too by degrowing.
Right.
You sacrifice a lot of vital things, and you sacrifice free time, and you sacrifice you know, the basic comforts that enable women, you know, and girls not to be slaving away in kitchens or you know, whatever.
At some level, just the argument of like, should we grow or should we like degrow? Is like just in like a general like GDP type thinking or something like that is almost silly too. Like we should be just focusing on the concrete things that can make life better while not burning up the planet and destroying all the natural world. And like, you know what I mean? It's like focusing on the things. But in terms of an outlook, it is interesting how it interacts with something like when you're trying to save a nuclear plant.
You know, I think what you just said is pretty beautiful. It's like, is growth the goal? Not necessarily, but is like improving human flourishing the goal? Like, I mean, like my politics can fundamentally be boiled down to like, I just want to see every human being achieve their full potential. I always thought like flourishing seemed a bit cheesy.
That's the modern part,
right?
You're not postmodern. You're still modern. What's going on?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, flourishing I find is language from the political center, right?
Yeah.
I hear it used in conservative circles, but I think it's a beautiful term.
I like the word.
Like everyone should flourish, and so we should be, you know, pursuing policies that enable that. If that involves some degree of growth, right on, right? Anyway, I mean, I think we're venturing into territory that I'm not like well enough read on to offer intelligent opinions. But I mean, that's some
no, because it is something we're still talking about, the communication thing, because it is something you run into.
Right. For sure.
If you're talking about, well, we actually need to increase energy production or electricity production, at least we need to electrify the grid, and you just run into a lot of very smart people, but who have their stuff focused, their attention focused on other things in life, where their just immediate reaction is like, no, we need to reduce everything. Like,
the cheapest kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour not used, but it's like, but we want to electrify.
I'm talking about people that don't know what a kilowatt hour is. You know what I mean? I'm still talking about
that. That is like a frequent statement you hear from green activists.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. And it's not untrue in certain ways. There's like obviously waste in the system and stuff, but I guess. Before we sign off, because we do have to get going, because you have to go work in an emergency room.
Indeed.
And how are we doing? Do we have acute radiation impacts yet?
I'm going to be like really pink and rosy on the left side of my neck.
Yeah, I'm definitely a little pink. I'm wearing my shortest shorts. So this the high thigh is rarely exposed for this amount of time to the sun. So yeah, I'll be joining you in the pink club.
We're gonna go for another dip, I think, in the beautiful Pickering waters.
Before we go, what's next for Decouple?
Oh man, yeah, it's really exciting. We've got a lot of things planned. What's already happened in terms of new developments? Dispatched Dylan Moon, my producer, to the Belgium stand-up, which I think is one of the biggest stand-up for nuclear events around the world, occurring in the Stalingrad for clean energy, where the Green Party is doing the climate own goal thing of trying to shut down 50% of the whole electricity production in the country and replace it with gas. So that was really exciting to send someone there to do live reporting and to create, do a series of interviews and sew something together. So Decouple is kind of gaining that capacity. We are going to be sending a media team, actually you and me. We're sending ourselves to COP26. So that's really exciting. Yeah, I mean, this is cool. This is new, right? Doing, getting out of my little studio and setting up a mobile studio here. I'd love to go to more nuclear plants and do more stuff like this.
Be like Jerry Seinfeld's show, like getting comedians getting coffee or coffee.
Yes.
It would be like scientists swimming next to nuclear plants.
No, but I mean, totally. Just being here at Pickering, like I want to do a kind of, I don't know, is it called Man on the Street? Like walking around, interviewing people, being filmed, like interacting with the public.
Vox Pop.
Vox Pop. We are trying to grow our YouTube channel. And then we're creating, you and I are working on this project of creating kind of 3 to 5 minute videos as kind of a gateway drug to get into the podcast, stuff that's more accessible. The podcast is wonky, right? It's not as wonky as Titans of Nuclear, but it's pretty wonky. You're listening to an hour to like some pretty highly educated people, and like I think as you were saying, like jumping into episode 40, like what's a PWR, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of acronyms that go unexplained now.
Yeah, so we're trying to create content that can, help stir. They start with Isabel Bemeke, and they're like, "Whoa, what? Nuclear clean?
Yeah.
Gummy bears, awesome!" And then they feed into like maybe some kind of deeper analysis with their 3 to 5 minute videos, and then they get hooked on the podcast. My producer actually just messaged me, Dylan just messaged me, he's at the Stand Up for Nuclear event for Nuclear New York, and he was handing out gummy bears, which is one of the things we do, emphasizing energy density. And the person
with some information, not just here's a gummy bear, eat it, and you'll immediately have downloaded the information into your
exactly. It's a tritium containing gummy bear.
5G gummy bears.
Scrambles your neurons to make you pro-nuclear. But she was like, what do you do? And he's like, I'm a producer for Decouple. And she was like, I listen to Decouple. Dr. Kiefer.
Okay.
Anyway, so I mean, it's a really heartening story. Like that, just a random.
Well, this was at a Stand Up for Nuclear event
in New York.
No, so she was at. That's not random.
This happened like 30 minutes ago.
Right. I'm just saying. Like, I just need to deflate the tires a little bit here. You're making it sound random, but she was at a stand-up for nuclear.
No, she was a passerby.
Oh, she was just walking by.
Random, bro.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So that's cool. So anyway, the podcast is developing. We did get a donation, not from industry, from an individual, which has helped. Which has got Dylan working for me part-time. Which flew him to Belgium. Thank you. Certainly, we are looking for more support to do more with the podcast. I'd love it to be a network at one day and have other reporters and things like that, more content. It's like a 10, 15-year plan. But yeah, it's continues to be a kick-ass, rewarding experience. And yeah, I'm loving it. In my life, I've shifted focus many times, but I feel like I'm kind of coming into myself as a thinker and again, just benefiting from all these wonderful people I get to talk to. It continues to be an amazing experience, and we'll be at episode 100 in another, I think, 14 shows.
Right.
So I don't know. We're gonna try.
If we factor in how much you've been increasing production over that 14 shows should take about 16 and a half days now, or something like this. It should be popped out.
We go in little blurbs. I had like 4 interviews one week, and I've had a couple weeks where I haven't done much, but you know how it is. Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited to be coming on and helping doing the videos.
Right.
I think we're gonna call it Decouple Studios.
Yeah.
Maybe. And to try and be sort of like a bridge to the people that have been left behind to like at episode 1 basically,
right?
To try and understand some of these basic concepts and some of the arguments and hopefully get some good video content out there in the world. There's already some good stuff out there. I've been doing some research for it to make sure I'm not kicking anybody in the heels.
Right.
And there's some good stuff out there, but I think we can put out some pretty original work.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw your kind of pilot, and Jesse's doing sort of like a John Oliver. Like you're seeking a number of people.
My influences are many.
Right, but I mean, you do have some like stand-up comedy background, so I'm really excited to see kind of how that pans out. I mean, I am excited by what I've seen so far, but that'll be coming out soon as well. Again, guys, in terms of, and gals, and humanoids, and non-humanoids, no.
Yeah, non-humanoids, who knows?
Sure. If you would like to support the podcast, we do have the Patreon. Go to the website, and yeah, we're going to do great things together. And also, like, I should say, like, a lot of this is about creating, like, it's journalistic and it's independent to a degree, but we are also trying to create, like, I think we're developing a mission based upon this, like, independent investigation and exploration. We're arriving at conclusions. It's not just enough to, like, understand the world. We want to change it. So creating resources that are useful for this pro-nuclear advocacy movement. synergizing with Stand Up for Nuclear, for instance, and creating resources that are applicable to advocates around the world. And our first video is on, the ludicrousness of prematurely closing existing nuclear.
Right.
So that's our little sneak preview for the pilot.
That's it. And now we're at a moment that in the Decouple podcast that for me is a very sad one since the last time I was on. Because the last time I was on, I actually paid you a compliment. And I said, you have a great sign off and take good care.
Right.
And then coming from an ER physician, it felt very good. It felt like you really cared about the guest.
Right.
It made me think of Brooke Gladstone from the On the Media podcast, who always finishes every interview with like, thank you very much, like in a very sincere way. And you had this sincerity in your voice, and then I put the light on it.
You jinxed me.
I jinxed it, and now I heard it. You said it to Jay Harris though.
Okay, but that was recorded. That was recorded before our first time. That's an old episode I released on We Can Do It, and I've kind of given up on it. It was a re-release when I was on vacation.
Oh wow. Okay, so I want to make a little mini petition here
to bring back
Take Good Care. It was sincere. Don't feel like you're forcing it. I deeply regret having brought that up in that episode. I really do, and I want it back. And it would always left me with a nice smile.
Jesse,
no matter how much I didn't understand from the episode.
Jesse, take good care, man. Thanks for having me on Uncouple.
You take good care too, man.
All right, man.